Good afternoon. We're thrilled to be presenting this webinar entitled Dotting the I's, What Lawyers Should Know About Intersex Variations, Bodily Autonomy, and Policies Impacting the Intersex Community. This panel is sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and is one of a series of rapid response webinars. We're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists, through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you don't see the controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. I'll be monitoring the Q&A and we'll do our best to address your questions time permitting. We'll be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. We have a dynamic panel today who will talk about legal issues facing people with intersex variations or innate variations in physical sex characteristics that cause their bodies to differ from male or female stereotypes. Our speakers today are Sylvan Fraser, the Legal and Policy Director from Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth, and Erica Larshbaugh, Executive Director of Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth. I'm Bobby Bitker. I'm the Chair of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Committee of the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks, Bobby. I'm Erica. Bobby just gave a bit of an introduction. I'm the Executive Director of Interact. I've been with the organization just since last summer and have spent a lot of time in policy advocacy work over the last decade or so. Really delighted to speak with you all today about the experiences of intersex people. I'm an intersex person myself, and our legal rights. And I'll hand off to Sylvan for a quick introduction.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sylvan Fraser. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Legal and Policy Director here at Interact, and we are so excited that you all are joining us today. Hopefully, this will be an educational experience, and as Bobby said, we encourage you to ask questions in the middle. We know this is going to be a lot of new material for a lot of you, so thank you again.
Yes, thanks very much. We'll start by just telling you a little bit about our organization. We are Interact, sometimes styled as Interact Advocates for Intersex Youth. As you can see, we advocate for the human rights of intersex people, and particularly children born with intersex variations. And we carry out our advocacy through three primary modes. One is our law and policy work, which is really our core work and the core mission of our organization. One is our media and consulting work, which I think is just as important in its way, especially because we, I will often say the first barrier to intersex rights is visibility. And so the more we are kind of raising the public consciousness, raising the public discourse, making people more aware and better educated, the better we do in terms of social change and securing our rights. And finally, we have over the last 10 or 15 years often done kind of advocacy development with some young intersex people, kind of helping them to tell their stories, helping them to be advocates for themselves, and also working with them collaboratively to do public advocacy together. A little bit of a roadmap for what we hope to cover today. As has already been mentioned, not everybody who is on this call may even have heard the term intersex before today, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's more common than you might think. Some folks have heard it, but may not have a great understanding of what it means. And so we will just kind of do some level setting, share with you the definition of intersex, a little bit of practical understanding about what that means, and also experiences that intersex folks commonly share. And we'll talk a little bit also about the ways that Our lived experiences can intersect with the transgender and non-binary communities' experiences, and also kind of set the table for how the legal implications of being intersex can overlap a bit with transgender and non-binary legal rights. In the second part, we will get a little more into the details of the legal framework through which we see and advocate around intersex rights. We'll talk at some length about the challenges that intersex community face, and in particular, harmful medical practices and harmful government policies. And at the end, we will just sort of wrap up by hopefully empowering you to, think differently about this issue broadly, and also in your lawyer brain. And we'll leave time for some Q&A. So again, if folks have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will try to address them as best we can. So just to start off with, we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be intersex. I'll go ahead and read the definition here, and then I'll share a little bit more about what it means. So intersex refers to bodies that express a wide range of physiological variations in sex characteristics and sex development that may not fit traditional conceptions about male or female bodies. This can mean a lot of different things. There is a, I guess I can go ahead and use the word here as long as I put it in scare quotes. A lot of people have not heard the term intersex. Lots of people have heard the term hermaphrodite. I put it in the quotes because many people regard it as a slur. I do not, so I'm comfortable saying it out loud to you. I will offer that because many people think it is a slur, or they feel it is an insult, doesn't describe who they are accurately, probably best not to use the term, but you will find it a lot of the time in medical literature, possibly in some legal literature, and it comes from a mythological idea of, some kind of fanciful creatures who are half this and half that, and it's really not a great way to describe what it means to be intersex. When we talk about it from a medical perspective, intersex bodies have natural differences in at least one of 7 components of sex. So the first thing we need to understand in order to understand what intersex means is just to understand what is sex. And we think we have a pretty simple understanding of it. You're male or you're female. Cool. In fact, sex is one more thing about human bodies that is pretty complex. And so there could be variations in someone's chromosomes. There can be genital variations. There can be variations in someone's gonads. They may have gonads that are not what you would expect for their phenotypical physical expression, or they may not have the gonads you would expect for their physical expression. Same with the internal sex organs. There can be variations that just simply don't match what you would expect based on what somebody's presentation is, or may not match, the most common middle of the plate understandings of what a male or female body may look like at all. These days people are paying a lot more attention to the ways that sex variations can include hormone production and hormone response, as well as secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics include things like, the growth of breasts, facial hair, how a body builds muscle mass, lots of other things that we may not always think of in the day-to-day as relating to one sex or the other, but in fact have a lot to do with how a body produces and responds to hormones. Here is the next question. How common is this? This is actually a matter of debate. And like many things, that matter of debate depends on what you include under the umbrella of intersex. For us at Interact, we include, every innate expression of some variation in sex development that, doesn't conform to typical understandings of male or female. Historically, there have been narrower definitions, and many advocates also are pushing for broader definitions. So very commonly, you'll see one of these two numbers, 0.5% or 2%. This is a range that has come out of different studies that were done over time. And as I've mentioned, in these days, many people will estimate that the percentage is closer to 5%, as the definition of intersex has grown to be more inclusive. So very commonly, you'll hear 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000 at the very low end. And what that number is actually associated with through the studies that were done, again, some years ago, are the proportion of the population that are born with physical expression of intersex that is so apparent at birth that they risk being subjected to medical interventions to conform their bodies to a typical male or female physical expression. The 2% includes folks who are, not presenting with that kind of intersex variation, but do have differences, less likely to be intervened with in their very early infancy or, in the first couple of years of their life, but particularly likely to experience things like early onset of puberty and then have more medical interventions at that time. Oh, wrong way. Pardon me. Here's an interesting question. Does the I belong with LGBTQ? We often are arguing that it does, and we'll talk a little bit more about why. Intersex is not a sexual orientation, and it's not a gender identity. But to the extent that the LGBTQ plus umbrella is thought of as an umbrella community or population of sexual and gender minorities, we argue that intersex definitely belongs in there. And one of the things we'll talk about a little bit more is how, even though intersex is neither a sexual orientation nor a gender identity, definitely there are lots of ways in which we are in solidarity. And that is true where the struggles of our communities overlap, and it is true where they don't as much. So we'll come back to these forms of solidarity again a little bit later. Finally, I just want to note one of the reasons we often, as intersex folks, get together with our trans siblings is because, I'm going to steal a tiny bit of Sylvan's thunder, our communities are both really affected by sex stereotyping. When we get into the legal talk, that's really the kind of meat of it. And what that means in practical terms is that if we're walking down the street, if we're doing our jobs, if we're entering a restroom, people may just, we all are a little, we all experience ambiguity in different ways. And so if we encounter something, I was a psychology major, now you can tell, if we encounter something that we find gives us a feeling of uncertainty, or we're not sure how to categorize it because our brains are just hardwired to do that, then we start asking questions, we get nervous, we are like, oh my gosh, I don't know. Basically, intersex people have that kind of experience where people are just kind of trying to clock our gender and be like, who are you? What is happening? And as a practical matter, that means that a lot of the discriminatory practices or discriminatory policies that are aimed at transgender people and transgender youth will also affect intersex people and intersex youth. And I think that is it for me. I will have the slides go the correct way and hand off to Sylvan.
Thank you, Erica, for that great introduction. So obviously we've started to cover, some common intersex experiences. This will just sort of be a little bit review, a little bit parsing together what the key issues facing intersex people are. Now, obviously, there are a lot of issues that might face intersex people depending on their particular life experiences, but these are some of the most common ones that we hear people ask us about at Interact when they reach out for help. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I was just going to talk a bit about how these are all sort of interrelated and mutually reinforcing these issues. We've got, as Erica touched on, the issue of unnecessary medical interventions to fix children's bodily variations. Oh, sorry, I'm getting feedback that it's difficult to hear me. Let me move this a little bit closer. Hopefully that's a little bit better. Okay, great. So we've got the practice of medically unnecessary surgeries, which are distinct from gender-affirming care in a lot of very important ways. First off, one kind of medical practice is consensual and medically necessary. The other one is neither of those things. There are some surgeries that will be medically necessary to perform on children with variations in their sex characteristics, but these are fairly rare. This would be a situation, for instance, if a child was born with no urinary opening whatsoever, that's a medical emergency that needs to be treated immediately. But there are other situations where a child might have a urethral opening that is perfectly fine, it's functioning perfectly well, but it is in a place that is not quite expected, such as not being quite at the very tip of the penis. And if a doctor suggests surgery to move the opening of the urethra, but it's already functioning, then that is not a medically necessary surgery. So we can get some sort of fine-grained distinctions here. There's also the issue of anti-intersex bias, which can come in the form of overt discrimination or just erasure. You know, some policies and practices will actively hurt intersex individuals, and others will sort of passively hurt intersex individuals because intersex people haven't even been contemplated or accounted for in the policy or practice and how it came to be and how it's being applied. We've also got a lack of competent care for intersex adults. This is a problem that is probably not very surprising to learn about, but given how much of the focus in the medical field is on treating intersex infants and young children when they don't necessarily even need medical attention, it's a little bit ironic that then intersex adolescents and adults will grow to find themselves in a situation where there aren't really a lot of specialists who are in a situation where they can offer them competent and ethical care. And that all contributes to poor health outcomes that we see the intersex community face. These things just all compound each other, and the medical harm often starts with these unnecessary interventions in infancy and early childhood, but continues through, you know, the stigma, discrimination, and then lack of competent care when you do actually need medical care. And we see this just come out in a lot of different domains of life. So what do these surgeries entail? There are a lot of different kinds of surgeries that might be performed depending on what someone's particular physiology and variation is. But we'll just give a little overview so you can understand the breadth of what's been happening. And for reference, these are still happening at hospitals all across the United States. Some surgeries, like I discussed, will move a already working urethra to be at the tip of the penis instead of where it has naturally occurred in the body. Others will create or modify a vagina. This might be a surgery to deepen the vagina or enlarge the vagina. And again, these are being performed on infants. This is not a gender-affirming vaginoplasty that someone will want to need to affirm their own gender. This will be something that occurs in infancy or you know, sort of prior to adolescence, when someone is often not consulted about this. We've also got surgeries to reduce or reposition a clitoris. It should be obvious why that's harmful to do. You know, we've got laws that prohibit other forms of female genital cutting, but not this one. At least, you know, there's a very good argument that those laws should be applied in this context, but so far they have not been. We've got surgeries that remove gonads. Gonads are like your ovaries or testes. They're responsible for fertility as well as hormone production. These are pretty important organs, and if they're taken out, you know, you can't get that fertility back. So that's at that point a sterilizing surgery. We've also got surgery that change the labia or scrotum, normally sort of labial reduction surgeries. There's guidance about whether and when to allow non-intersex adolescents to access surgeries that change their labia, because it's recognized that social pressures go into the desire to have that surgery for a lot of people. However, these surgeries are being carried out on infants without any of the same guidance being followed, and for, you know, mostly the same reasons. It's just adults around the child sort of making that decision for them instead of the desire coming from the individual. So what are some of the consequences of these surgeries? Obviously, these are all major surgeries that can have life-altering effects that go on for someone's entire life. We're talking about things that are intensely personal, you know, sexual function, someone's gender identity, reproductive function. These are all very, very personal matters that someone really should have the right to have a say in for themselves. So the loss of sexual sensation and function is something that we see with almost any of these surgeries. It's a possibility. Chronic pain, nerve damage, and scarring just sort of typical things that might happen after any surgery. We've got urinary incontinence. That's a common one if you are surgically adjusting structures that are part of or near the urethra. The risk of anesthesia in early childhood is something that we don't talk about very often as a society, because typically we assume that if someone is doing surgery on a baby, it must be pretty important, pretty urgent to do, but that's really not the case here. So infants are being subjected to risks to their brain development from anesthesia for reasons that are really not valid, in our opinion, to run that risk. Loss of natural hormone production if the surgery is a gonadectomy. That will require someone to be on hormone replacement therapy for the rest of their lives afterward. Permanent infertility, again, if those gonads are removed or any other internal reproductive structures, that will have impacts on fertility. There's just no way around that. And then we see consequences like PTSD, depression, intimacy difficulties, stigma, body image issues, the whole gamut of things that might happen if someone's body has been altered in this really fundamental way without their input or consent. And then another one is the enforcement of an incorrect sex assignment. Anytime that you are doing a surgery to conform someone's sex characteristics without their own input to, something closer to the ideal male or female body, if they don't identify with the gender that you've ultimately assigned to them, that's just going to compound all these other harms. And we should also state that even if someone does turn out to identify with the gender that's been assigned to them through this process, that doesn't mean that it would have been a surgery that they would have chosen for themselves, or that the surgery would prioritize what they want for their own body and life. Given the list of consequences, it's still not safe enough to say, oh, well, we did a feminizing surgery on this infant, and it turns out that she identifies as a girl after all. That doesn't mean that it was safe or a good idea without consulting the patient. So then we see, extending beyond childhood, there are a lot of impacts of discrimination just out in day-to-day life. So this was a survey done by the Center for American Progress. We should note that in this sample, this happened to survey only people who are LGBTQ+. So the intersex people in the sample are also LGBTQ+, apart from being intersex. We're working on having more robust data collection so that we could compare different cross-sections of the community, such as intersex people who do not identify under the separate LGBTQ+ umbrella. However, these are the data that we have here today. But as you can see, the disparities are pretty large in a lot of these domains. These are data points showing how often someone engaged in a sort of avoiding behavior, to avoid discrimination. Whether that's avoiding doctor's offices, avoiding seeking medical care when they need it, avoiding going into stores and restaurants, other places in public life, changing the way that they dress to sort of conceal perceived gender variation or their mannerisms, making decisions about where to work, and of course avoiding law enforcement. These are all things that, as you can see from this chart, LGBTQ people who are not intersex also engage in these behaviors, but people who are intersex engage in them at much higher rates. So discrimination is just very real for this community. That's really what we wanted to show with this graph. And finally, as I touched on before, all of these factors contribute together to health disparities that we see. This is from the same survey. So these are LGBTQ+ people who are intersex versus LGBTQ+ people who are not intersex. These are some pretty shocking numbers. And we have seen numbers similar to this in at least one smaller survey that was exclusive to intersex people, not necessarily LGBTQ. And we just see really, really concerning rates of physical and mental health difficulties over the lifespan. And that goes back to potentially a history of non-consensual early childhood surgery, potentially a history of having their own bodily variation and medical history concealed from them. That practice used to be extremely common, and still happens from time to time. And then the lack of competent care when it's needed. All of these things combine together to produce some of the outcomes that we see. The point to understand here is that these things are not inevitable. They're not inevitable consequences of being intersex. They're consequences of how medicine and society have treated intersex people and continue to do so. So now we're going to talk about some of the legal implications, how policies can and do and should address intersex people. So the first lens we're going to use to talk about this is sex discrimination. There's another argument that disability discrimination could apply. We're not going to get into that as much today, but that is another thing to be aware of. So we're starting to see more and more often legislation, federal rules, guidance that conceptualizes discrimination against intersex people as a form of sex discrimination. And I think that that makes a lot of sense, and I hope that you'll all agree. Sex characteristics are physical, they're in the body. And as Erica went over, there are multiple components of what we consider to be sort of physiological sex that are implicated in intersex variations, where it would be pretty difficult to say that someone's being discriminated against on the basis of their intersex variation and to not imagine that that is somehow related to their sex. So all of these quotes that we have here are from some updated guidance in the DOJ Title IX legal manual. These updates were made after the Bostock decision came out. And this just speaks to the applicability of Title IX to discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation, and references that the reasoning in those interpretations applies with equal force to discrimination against intersex people. So several sort of paths to that analysis are laid out here, all from the same document, all from the US DOJ. And the point here is that there are a lot of different ways that you could analyze a claim of discrimination against an intersex person, but almost all of them would fit within our understanding of how a sex discrimination claim would work. What constitutes discrimination on the basis of sex. It could be because of someone's perceived differences between their specific sex characteristics and the sex category that they've been assigned to or that they identify as. It could be because of their particular characteristics and the combination that they appear in that might be different than what is expected based on stereotypes about male or female bodies. And sort of any way you slice it, it's going to be sex discrimination. It's hard to get around that argument. So we're glad to see that being recognized more and more often. And in the healthcare context specifically, the proposed rule on Section 1557, healthcare non-discrimination under the Affordable Care Act, the proposed rule that we saw does prohibit discrimination against intersex people as a form of sex discrimination. So sort of like we were seeing with that DOJ Title IX legal guidance. We are hoping that the final rule will be released soon and that it will, again, provide some more explicit protection for intersex people in the healthcare context. And then moving away from the sex discrimination universe per se, there's a lot to do with medical malpractice and informed consent in essence, and how there is not proper informed consent the vast majority of the time when these surgeries are performed on young children. There's a question of who even has the ability to give informed consent for these procedures. Parents typically do provide permission, but they do so almost never with proper information about the risks and the long-term consequences of these surgeries, without information sometimes even about what their child's diagnosis is, what the alternatives are to surgery, including just postponing and waiting and seeing, whether any health difficulty does come up for the child that would require a certain form of treatment, or if the child is going to desire any form of treatment once they are older. So when you sort of look at the intersection of informed consent and sex discrimination, it starts to look more like sex discrimination when these interventions are being proposed on children because of their variation in sex characteristics, when the same high-risk, medically unnecessary intervention would not be proposed on a child without that variation. So now we're going to move into talking about how we think of autonomy and how we think of defending autonomy. I want to sort of set up two contrasting frames. We've got, on the one hand, autonomy as defending access to healthcare. So obviously top of mind for almost everyone right now would be abortion, contraception, gender-affirming care. Obviously, there's a lot going on nationally with these right now. So safeguarding access to these is incredibly important. Now, on the other hand, autonomy could also be conceptualized as defending someone from harmful practices. So the examples that we bring up here, because they're all similar and oftentimes legitimately overlapping with intersex surgeries, would be involuntary sterilization, female genital cutting, and conversion therapy. So these are examples of areas where instead of defending access to something, we really have to safeguard someone's autonomy by protecting them from something that is being done to them without proper consent. So here's an example. This is currently up on this website. This is Weill Cornell Medicine in New York. They are one of the major hubs for these early medically unnecessary intersex surgeries. This is just to give you an idea of sort of how these surgeries are talked about and justified in medical settings. So between the ages of 3 and 6 months old, very, very young. That's so far in advance of when someone could have any idea of who they are or what they want for their body. It is common practice for surgeons to operate on children with variations that are obvious by this point in their life, which, as Erica mentioned, is not everyone with intersex variations, but infants who do have an obvious physical variation, usually involving their genitals, might be subjected to surgeries for reasons such as, quote, being able to undergo a more natural psychological and sexual development when they have a normal appearing vagina. This is just abhorrent to me. Hopefully it is to most of you as well. This is an attempt to engineer someone's sexuality and gender identity and to erase their bodily variation for no reason but adults' distress over the possibility that their variation might cause them to not have a heterosexual cisgender body in future. So this is feminist science and technologies scholar Catherine Clune-Taylor, also a board member at Interact. And I think Catherine hits the nail right on the head here. You know, the goal of these surgeries really is erasing difference in order to try and force a heterosexual cisgender body in future onto a child who we've got no way of knowing how they're going to identify in the future. We just don't. So efforts that we've undertaken before to attempt to curb these practices and defend bodily autonomy include some legislation. This is a text from a bill that we had introduced previously in the state of California. It did not pass. All that we were saying here was before the age of 12, there should be restrictions on surgeons' abilities to perform certain procedures, detailed here: clitoral reduction, gonadectomy, hypospadias surgery, and vaginoplasty on children born with variations in their sex characteristics. So this would not have impacted gender-affirming care. This would not have impacted circumcision. Things that, you know, I'll just get those out of the way. These are questions that we always get about the applicability of bills that we are proposing. And it couldn't make it, you know. This bill was opposed really vociferously by medical associations in the state, although we do have a lot of robust support from medical associations like GLAMA, Health Professionals Advancing LGBTQ Equality, and the American Academy of Family Physicians. We've got a lot of medical specialists on our side who understand that these surgeries are too high risk and too harmful to do if the balance of reasons to justify an intervention are not there. And it's really, you know, the surgeons who are lobbying against restrictions on these practices tend to be urologists, endocrinologists who are often not doing the surgeries themselves, but are instrumental members of the team that would be deciding to impose the surgery on a young child. So we see a lot of self-interest there in perpetuating these practices sort of within the sectors of the profession that are responsible for carrying them out. Whereas we see medical students, you know, gay and lesbian medical associations really standing up and saying, this practice isn't right and it needs to come to an end. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we see opposition to intersex bodily autonomy playing out. I know that this is a long quote. I'm sorry for putting so much text on this slide, but I think it's important to see there are so many ways that providers will attempt to justify the practice of early intersex surgery. This is one way, by deliberately conflating it with gender-affirming care. So think back to that slide from Weill Cornell Medicine, showing that between the ages of 3 and 6 months old, a vaginoplasty was considered to be necessary so that an infant could have a, quote, normal appearing vagina so that they would develop as a, quote, normal girl, which, by the way, is not guaranteed to be an outcome of that surgery. Plenty of people develop without a female gender identity under those circumstances. So this is an example of a surgeon in the state of California testifying against one of our pieces of legislation, trying to make the argument that if we restricted these surgeries on young intersex babies, that it would be tantamount to restricting gender-affirming care. And that's just not true. The argument really falls apart if you know how to look at it properly, but they were taking advantage of the fact that most people don't already understand the distinctions between these practices. and tried to frame our protective bill as an attack on gender-affirming care. So that is sort of round one of how doctors have attempted to continue the practice of early intersex surgeries. And on the next slide, we'll see round two of attempting to continue the practice by distinguishing it from gender-affirming care. So this, it's ironic, you know, people who want to continue this practice will sort of use either argument that suits them, depending on the political context. This is an excerpt from the Arkansas Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act, one of these terrible anti-transgender bills that we've seen being introduced and unfortunately passed in some states around the country. So as you probably all are already familiar with, these bills set out certain kinds of procedures that are common in gender-affirming care and put restrictions on those procedures to ostensibly protect adolescents from the harms that people introducing those bills claim are associated with gender-affirming care. Those, the risks that they claim are associated there are really not well documented. They've been debunked. And importantly, if someone is choosing gender-affirming care for themselves, they have the opportunity to say, you know, these are my priorities for my body and for my life. This care aligns with those priorities and I want it and I need it. So very, very different context from intersex surgeries where those things are not the case. But nonetheless, in most of these bills, there is an explicit exception written in to allow doctors to continue performing surgeries on intersex infants while they are prohibited from offering gender-affirming care to transgender adolescents. So this is exactly backwards from how things should be to allow people to enjoy their right to bodily autonomy and to make their own medical decisions. This is a map that Interact put together in collaboration with Human Rights Watch and UNC Human Rights Law Program. So as you can see, and this has not been updated for this legislative session, by the way, this was current as of this fall. So almost all of the states that have introduced, or by that point had introduced, these bills that would be restricting access to gender-affirming care, almost all of them contain an exception that would allow intersex surgeries to continue without medical necessity or individual consent. So it's surprising that people aren't talking about this more often than they are, given that it's a feature of almost every one of these bills. You know, obviously the intended target of these anti-trans attacks are transgender youth, but intersex youth are really, you know, they're collateral damage here. And the fact that these bills hurt both communities and target both communities to allow harm to come to them is really just, it's abhorrent to all of us. So I want to touch just briefly on some of the unintended consequences of the very important backlash to this wave of anti-trans bills. Obviously, it is hugely important to resist these efforts to restrict gender-affirming care and to harm and ostracize transgender youth. But sometimes the messaging against these bills will use talking points like doctors know what is best for their patients, parents know what is best for their children, you know, trust doctors, trust parents, when we could be saying trust children, you know, trust youth, let them grow up and lead their own decisions. Decisions should be made by doctors and families. That's another talking point that we hear, sort of aimed at defending the practice of gender-affirming care. But these are also talking points that are used to defend the practice of early intersex surgeries. Legislation interfering with the practice of medicine or interfering in doctors' abilities to follow the standard of care, sort of the same deal. You know, if we are grounding the importance of access to gender-affirming care in the fact that doctors think it's a good idea, appeals to medical authority can be very helpful and very effective on the one hand. But on the other hand, that sets us up very poorly to advocate for intersex autonomy when the harm is coming from within the medical establishment, because they are setting standards for what they believe is proper to do. So I just wanted to point those things out. It's just, you know, it's good to be mindful when we are trying to resist harm in one area. It's always good to try and not do unintentional harm in another area. So what does it mean to move intersex rights forward? That's a good question, and one that we hope will provide you with some tools that you can leave here with today.
Thanks, Sylvan. I'll pick it up a little bit from here. As you may be able to tell from the focus of our conversation here today, we are not shy about saying that even if it doesn't necessarily impact everyone in the intersex community or everyone who has variations in their sex traits, by far the most pressing, most violating experience that is common to some intersex people are these medical interventions, and particularly non-consensual surgeries that are performed on young children. And so, of course, we invite all of you to, check out our website, interactadvocates.org, check out groups like the Intersex Justice Project. If you find it compelling that, here in the United States, we're debating as a matter of legal rights, something that the global human rights community has long and loudly recognized as a human rights violation, as a core violation of a child's autonomy, and so, here are just a few of the graphics that some of our youth have been involved in making. And I don't know if there are any Steven Universe fans in the audience today, but that's the cartoon areas from the creator of Steven Universe. We have, we have not all terrible news to share. We have had a lot of wins, and in particular in the last couple of years with the Biden administration, we have seen a lot of forward movement in the ability of the federal government to recognize intersex people, to understand the challenges and the discrimination that we experience, and to begin to take some steps, some actionable steps to make sure that intersex futures are a little bit brighter. Happily, we have had some good experiences in New York City, where I'm based, and the former health commissioner had worked with intersex children and was a big proponent of deferring any surgeries until children could participate in medical decision-making themselves competently, and was a part of passing one of the first pieces of legislation anywhere in the US to deal with intersex rights, which is a campaign, just a public health, public education campaign, so that parents who find that their children are born with variations in their sex characteristics can be a little bit better informed. Well, here is more about that particular bill. And so Sylvan mentioned Human Rights Watch. They have been a great partner of ours. And one of the things that I often will ask folks to do in thinking about how to be a good ally to intersex people is to kind of think about intersex issues and experiences in broader frames. So one of the reasons I bring that up here is because particularly in the US, and particularly with lawyers who work domestically in the US, we tend to come at things from a civil rights, legal rights kind of frame. And this is very different from the human rights frame that has dominated this conversation in the global context. This is a very American tradition. You can look at our Constitution and understand why we are the way we are when it comes to these things. And it's a very lawyerly tradition. If it's not written down, does it really exist? And so we're really happy that places with more developed kind of human rights laws and an understanding that, people don't just have rights because some lawyers wrote it down somewhere. People have rights because they're humans, and we have dignity and autonomy and the ability to determine for ourselves and express for ourselves who we are. So I kind of just, like to ask folks to take a step back and think of it in those terms, especially for lawyers, because we're always coming from that civil rights, non-discrimination approach. And often unless we also have like a public health degree. I like to ask people to try to think about it in terms of public health and public equity as well. Now that I've said all that, back to the discrimination, because this is an ABA webinar and we are lawyers. So, last year, actually, that's not last year anymore, 2021, time is flying. In 2021, a really historic thing took place, which was the first time that the White House invited intersex folks to come for a roundtable on Intersex Awareness Day in October. We had another similar event last year. We're hoping it's an every year kind of thing now. But this was really the first opportunity that any federal administration has ever taken to hear from people with variations in their sex characteristics, how that has impacted their lives. Many of them have undergone these non-consensual medical interventions and were able to share about how that has impacted their lives. And so just really pleased with the kind of the progress that's being made, particularly at the federal level. And, we still have some optimism about where we can get in states like California, New York, where folks are a little more prone to, understanding that different people are different ways and it's okay. And in the meantime, while actually pushing for legislative change and regulatory change is tough, it's an uphill battle. We're doing a lot of work inside both the healthcare professions at large and the legal profession to help elevate people's understanding of the issue, to help people understand where the kind of basic intersection of people's autonomy and things like parental consent and all of that, where those things collide, like help understand and unpack that with people. And so I'm going to kick back to Sylvan just for a moment to talk a little bit about the proposed resolution that is before the ABA.
Thanks, Erica. So here we have the text of a proposed resolution. Huge thanks to Bobby Bitker here for helping shepherd this along. This would really be a big deal for the community. This would put the American Bar Association on record as supporting intersex human rights, intersex bodily autonomy, by opposing federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal legislation, regulation, and agency policy that attempts to impose medical or surgical intervention on minors with intersex traits without the minor's informed consent or assent. So just what we were talking about. And urging licensed professionals not to conduct these interventions until the minor requests the proposed care, understands the impact of the proposed care, as well as any alternatives thereto, and is provided with affirming psychosocial supports. And then after that, if they give their informed consent or assent, the intervention is definitely something that they want and need, they should have it. We're not opposed to surgery or other medical interventions. We just want there to be a robust informed consent process like there are for other kinds of medical interventions. And of course, if there's a medical emergency, like one of those rare cases that we touched on earlier in the presentation, those surgeries would not be impacted by policies like this. Those would still be allowed to go forward. So the fact that this is before the House of Delegates is a huge deal. It would do a lot for the intersex community, for visibility, and for the struggle for autonomy. So Bobby, I'm not sure if there's more that you have to say about this, but we're just so grateful that this is under consideration, and we would be very happy to discuss it more with anyone who's got questions.
Same. Thank you both. Yeah, this was actually very important for me to introduce because one of the more recent resolutions that I drafted and introduced was about trans health rights for minors. And that was adopted with overwhelming support. And I think once people who are in our discipline are educated, they really do want to support these rights. But I think there's a lot of cloudiness, both politically, there are misunderstandings about the facts. And I think it really just goes a lot to educating people about what the issues are, why it's an issue, and why it's important. And once that happens, people really get on board with supporting these rights and this autonomy. And I think one of the issues that this webinar addresses, one reason why this was so important is because in the LGBTQI, I mean, most of the time the I isn't even there. It's a question, do T and I belong there? And that's a whole other philosophical issue. But intersex people are so often overlooked. Their needs are overlooked, their rights are overlooked, and then they're co-opted by people who are using them for their own purposes. And we really need to protect them as a marginalized group. We need, because the intersex population is very small, we can't do this without allies, and we need those allies to be educated.
Thanks so much for that, Bobby. I will, just before we kind of close and take questions, just say a few more things about broadly how folks can step up allyship, and just want to shout out the folks in the chat and in the Q&A who are intersex, who are present with us today. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your experiences a little bit with your colleagues in the chat. That actually aligns really well with the first point here, which is just sort of, get educated. So many people that I'm like delighted with how many people are here today, because so many people here today have raised their awareness and opted in for that. So just, thank you for that. And as it is with all things, like learning is a lifelong thing. And, particularly in the areas of sex and gender and human sexuality, there's so much complexity. And here's my interpsych major talking again. The ways that our professions have treated sex and gender and sexuality as so like one-dimensional, so not reflective of the full breadth and diversity of human biology, human psychology, and human experience. It's so good that we are moving away from that, and really appreciate people's willingness to sit with some ideas that may challenge notions that you hold. And, always here for questions. Erica@interactadvocates.org. I know EDs don't normally answer everyone's questions, but you just can totally send them to me. I want to. Second, in the particularly for folks who are doing policy work, really kind of again pushing past the really like black and white formal legal rights framework, and understanding that people's basic human rights are implicated here, and try to raise that where you can. There are so many communities and so many issue areas where our basic autonomy and dignity and self-determination are at issue. Right now, I'm thinking particularly about reproductive rights and all that has happened in the last year with that. And, we're in solidarity with all groups of people who are working to further their bodily autonomy. And we deeply wish to link arms and be beneficiaries of that solidarity as well. And finally, anywhere in your organization, like, as an intersex rights organization, we're kind of scooting around all the time and being like, don't forget the I, don't forget the I. And there may be places where, if you're looking at just a specific population, like many surveys, many forms of case law even might just apply to people based on their sexual orientation, might just apply to people based on their gender identity. If those things are true, it might actually not make sense to include the I and include intersex people in whatever it is you're working on. But whenever you're using the acronym broadly, we'd love to encourage people to include the I. And whenever you are working inside your organization or otherwise with policies in the workplace, wherever, that deal with discrimination against people on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Our ask is that you contemplate whether people might also experience discrimination on the basis of their sex characteristics. And just kind of think inclusively in that way. And one last thing is, and I'll just leave this up for a minute. Folks might be interested to take a look at our Intersex Inclusive Language and Messaging Guide. I'm actually going to open this on my phone right now because I'm horrified that if I try to look at it on the computer and highlight a couple of things for you guys, I am actually just going to go right off the screen forever. For folks who are doing any kind of legal or policy work around intersex issues, if it's not specific to your client, always feel free to reach out to us for sure. We do a lot of consulting and riding along on these matters, and we are basically the legal advocacy organization working on intersex issues in the US primarily. So always feel free to reach out. If you're just doing something like, let's say it's an internal company policy, or you're putting out something that has to do with LGBTQI population broadly. There's just a few pointers here in this document that will help you kind of navigate that, make decisions about what is good language. And again, us though, we are a tiny organization and not always as responsive as we would love to be. With all of that, we're so grateful again that folks have come today. Obviously, we really appreciate you considering the resolution if you're ABA members. I feel like we're right on time, which is weird and great, and we'll take some questions. I'm going to try to also get back into the Q&A because there were a few things that I had my eyes on, but I wanted to flag. Someone asked about Bostock, and someone asked about disability rights intersection.
Erica, I think the disability question is the very first one at the top. So
okay, great. And so I'm flagging those for Sylvan if you're interested in talking about either of those at any particular length, because I think you might be.
There were a couple that I wanted to pick up on, and I think they go together. Great. And they're pretty baseline. And they're very relevant to the resolution as well. So one question is, can you explain when a child has the right, or at what age, to make a decision on any surgical process to alter sex characteristics when the adult parent clearly has legal rights? The other question that I think goes with this, which is an important point, isn't it the parents who are forcing a gender onto a young child? Don't surgeons need parental consent?
So thank you so much for flagging those two, Bobby. I think it's exactly right to look at those together as well. So some of the considerations here really are pretty subtle. In most cases, when a parent is giving permission for these surgeries to take place, they're normally not marching into the doctor's office and saying, I want you to do surgery on my intersex baby. The surgeries are, the vast majority of the time, suggested by the medical team. Parents often aren't familiar with intersex variations to begin with, or with the fact that surgeries are even a practice that would be considered an option. These are normally suggested and carried out by doctors who have a long professional history of doing these interventions, or perhaps their mentors did. And the practice is rooted in outdated ideas about sex and gender, and about difference, and about how to erase differences to make people have a better life, supposedly. And of course, that's not true. It's not valid that erasing someone's natural differences is going to give them a better life. Instead, it's going to cause a lot of complications, a lot of stigma. Again, we see a lot of parallels to conversion therapy in this context. You can't just make someone different than how they are and expect them to thank you for it. It's going to cause a lot of physical and psychological damage instead. So part two of the answer to this question is that when parents give permission for these surgeries, they almost never have an adequate idea of what their child's diagnosis is, what their true medical needs are, what the surgery is ostensibly supposed to accomplish, what the risks of the surgery would be, the short and long-term care that will be necessitated as a result of the surgery as their child grows up. So there are extremely valid questions over whether the informed consent that is being given by the parents is even adequate in this context. And even more fundamentally, there's a legitimate question about whether this is the type of procedure that parents even have the right to give consent for. Whoever asked that question about, parents clearly having the legal right, it is true that we generally allow parents to make medical decisions in the best interest of their children, but there are restrictions on this. Certain procedures are out of bounds by law, or just by the fact that doctors don't offer procedures like that. Female genital cutting is one example. Sterilization that is not medically necessary on minors is another example. There are guidelines, and sometimes that have the force of law, about what you can and cannot do. We would argue that intersex surgeries are really in that same type of category, where the benefits are not clear enough in terms of actually accruing to the individual instead of to the adults around the individual who might be experiencing some discomfort with the idea of variation. And the risks are too high. And to sort of get at another question that I think I saw pop up, there are no demonstrated downsides to waiting to perform these procedures, again, unless they are, a medically urgent situation, which is pretty rare. So you can just really wait and let the child grow up and see how they feel in their body, see, what their own priorities are, and make a decision later on about surgery. And many intersex people that reach out to us who are part of the community do not choose surgery if they are given the option to choose or not choose it. Many people are very happy with their natural bodies. And again, if they do want some intervention, having that later on is no problem. It's very feasible to do. A lot of the same techniques that would be used for a gender-affirming procedure would be used surgically or hormonally in that case as well. And that would be just so much safer across the board than performing a surgery in infancy or early childhood that may never be wanted or needed by the person that is being performed on. In terms of the age that we would say that a child could be competent to give assent or consent, that is a tricky one. It's really the considerations about when these decisions could be made, taking into account all of the information that someone would need to be able to assess. It's not necessarily a black and white situation, but we would refer you to the WPATH guidelines, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. They just released an update last fall that for the first time includes more detailed guidance and discussion about children with intersex variations, and sort of how decisions about care in that context relate to or differ from decisions about gender-affirming care for transgender adolescents. So we think that a lot of the same considerations really go into each kind of decision. It's considerations around your gender identity, your body, how you want your body to look, feel, and function, what feels affirming and important for you. And even though the communities are not the same, there is overlap. And even where there is not overlap anymore, there are still similarities. So that's maybe not a satisfying answer to everyone, but that's what we've got.
So thank you. There is another question, actually, which in doing my own research for this resolution, I came up against barriers, and I think it would be really helpful if you could discuss this a little bit. What do you recommend for best practice in data collection to ensure that health and medical records appropriately record sex and intersex status for patients who identify as intersex? Should sex assigned at birth have an other option, or are there preferred codes for interoperability? Because when I was researching this, there is absolutely no requirements anywhere that doctors record that an infant is born with intersex characteristics.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. We've been getting so many more inquiries about inclusive data collection over the last few years. And obviously the contexts are pretty diverse here, whether we're talking about designing a demographic question for a survey or keeping track of detailed medical information in someone's medical records. These won't always look like the same way of assessing or keeping track for somebody. But we don't generally recommend treating intersex as a separate category in terms of sex assigned at birth, for instance. it's just not really the case that people are like assigned intersex at birth. We've heard of maybe a few scattered cases over the country where a small number of times someone might have ended up with intersex written in pen on their original birth certificate, but that's just not really that's not really common, and that would probably confuse matters more than anything to sort of have like an intersex category there. But if we are talking about designing like a demographic question for a survey, Interact does have resources on sort of recommended language to use. We'd be happy to consult on that if anyone wants to reach out. For medical records, electronic health records and things like that, after consulting with our medical experts who we work closely with, we have started to recommend just doing an organ inventory for patients. That can also be helpful for anyone who's got physiological features that are different than what might be expected based on stereotypes, and that might be because they've got an intersex variation, or it might be because they're transgender and have undergone some gender-affirming procedures, or it might be because someone has had cancer and has had certain organs removed. So there's a lot of reasons that someone's body might not conform exactly to what someone would expect, medically speaking, if they are sort of trying to look at the chart and get an idea of what organs to look at, or risk factors to account for, and really just having a specific documentation of what is going on in someone's body can be very helpful for that kind of thing.
Thank you, Sylvan. Erica, this is the question that you flagged, so I'm not sure if you want to take this one, but I think this is a great question. We have somebody who's asking, is intersex considered a disability? So, they're saying they also guess it could depend on the individual, but it's obviously an issue that relates to the availability of the ADA and 504 if there are challenges presented.
Sure. And this is, I guess flatly the answer is no. Intersex by itself does not necessarily qualify as a disability. Anecdotally, I will tell you that a lot of intersex folks I know do have physical disabilities, and a lot of the time it is actually because of the medical interventions that were performed upon them as children. So, like any other thing, if, here is where the civil rights approach to this can kind of fall short, and we do deal with this in our work sometimes. If your explicitly protected class is just people whose sexual orientation or gender identity is minority. So many things wrong with this already, but that's how our civil rights law has evolved. Then you can make arguments for why those things might protect intersex people, or might be read to protect intersex people. There's an in my mind obvious analog between that and the disability rights framework, where I saw questions in the chat about what, in my mind as I read it, I was like, oh, medical malpractice. I saw more than one question about the intersection with disability issues. I'm going to kick it to Sylvan for any more additional thoughts that are probably a little more weedsy, if they have any. Broadly, it's not a disability, and I do also want to iterate that because we're talking about human biology, we are also talking about matters of the body that can fairly be characterized as medical matters, and also can be over medicalized to the point where they're actually interfering with people's identity, interfering with people's autonomy. And as I also mentioned in answering one of my questions, there are a lot of folks who have variations in their sex characteristics who don't identify as intersex, and just identify, well, they don't identify at all. They talk about it as a medical condition that they have. And that is fair. And they also, should be able to be free from discrimination in their healthcare treatment. So similarly, people experience many people may experience many different kinds of challenges that relate to intersex traits, even if they're not directly a result of the intersex traits. Do you want to say anything more, Sylvan, about the specific disability law aspects here?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert in disability law particularly, so this is something that we do and will continue to consult with colleagues on if and when situations like this arise. But in terms of accommodation, there certainly could be disability-related arguments that come up, especially if someone does have complications from, say, a prior non-consensual surgery that might leave someone with physical or like mental health challenges that could require accommodation. If we're talking about non-discrimination, there is an argument that under any sort of regarded as prong, if someone else is regarding someone's intersex variation as a disability, then that could also be a way to sort of access protections in that context.
Right. And I think we find the same thing when we talk about transgender individuals needing to get diagnoses for insurance coverage. And it's a lot about the logistics and not so much about whether these are actual disabilities. I think we have time for one more question. I think this is actually a really important one. Are there legal avenues for intersex people to pursue should they experience incompetent medical practices such as surgeries without consent that later resulted in medical complications? And since there was a fairly important case about this, I thought maybe you want to talk about it a little bit so people are aware.
We're actually not permitted to talk about that case in particular. However, I will say, if that is a question that is coming up in your professional practice, if you know anyone, who is having this come up as an issue, refer them to us, please. We will absolutely have a conversation with you about this. It is often the case that due to statutes of limitation, by the time someone finds out that they were harmed by an early life surgery like this, it is often, unfortunately, not a viable legal claim. But that's not always the case. Different laws have different intricacies, depending on how a state has applied its discovery rule, if it has one. There can be ways to bring an action, and we would be very happy to discuss any specific situations with anyone who would like to reach out.
Erica, do you have anything to add?
Well, broadly, I guess I would just say, we are lawyers, and so I don't want to keep ragging on the law. But there are just limitations in the law. Our job as advocates is to argue those limitations are short-sighted. Those limitations didn't take something into account. Those limitations shouldn't apply here, right? But if you look at like a medical malpractice claim, for example, there are reasons. I don't want to get into it because I don't want to write any opponent's briefs for them, but there are reasons why a medical malpractice claim here might not prevail. Same with other kinds of ways into this. And it makes me want to sort of highlight something that I raised, something that I answered in the chat, which is, again, the kind of difference, and Sylvan was talking about this too, the difference between consent and assent. It turns out to be really key because, consent is a legal right. It's a creature of statute in every state in the union, as far as I know. And in every state in the union, a parent has the legal right to consent to medical care for their child until whatever state or locality vests that interest in the child themselves. So, if there's a mature minors doctrine or something like that in your state, a kid who can understand what a doctor is talking about and can understand what it means for their body and can understand the risks can give informed consent by law in many states. Assent just means agreeing to something. It means the same thing, but you take all the legal framework away and it just means agreeing to something. And I think that, I want to keep pulling it back to, we need as a legal community to be thinking really creatively about people's dignity and autonomy and the arguments we might make to say where our law is inadequate. we need to push it in this direction. We need to make this part more specific. We need to make the law serve the people that it is intended to serve. So if I was going to leave everybody with one big thought, that's my big thought. And I hope it actually is pertinent to the questions too.
Great. I want to thank you both so much. There was so much information here. I know there are a number of questions in the Q&A section that we haven't gotten to where people are asking about resources. And I really want to reiterate for everybody, go to interactadvocates.org. It has been an amazing resource for me as an attorney. There are resources for lay people, for educators. There is a lot of information there. So I strongly suggest that you check that out. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us for this free webinar. We really want to express our gratitude from the ABA for our esteemed panelists. You did an amazing job. Thank you so, so much. I think people learned a lot. You're doing critical work. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to share your expertise. The section of the Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and for advocates nationwide. We hope this helps all of you in your work, and please consider joining and becoming active in the American Bar Association. You can do so at americanbar.org/CRSJ. Best of luck in your work, everybody, and please stay safe.